Next we have Lauren Zullo. She's with the Natural Resources Defense Council, where she's the Director of National Initiatives, the City Energy Project. This is a joint initiative between Natural Resources Defense Council and the Institute for Market Transformation. And she's working to establish successful, replicable, market-based policies and programs that improve energy performance and reduce the carbon footprint of the built environment. She joined NRDC in 2012 as an Environmental Innovation Fellow for NRDC's Center for Market Innovation. Prior to NRDC, she worked for a commercial real estate development firm, Greenbaum and Rose Associates, in Washington, D.C., where she focused on sustainability and asset management. She attended Bowdoin College, Bowdoin, and serves on USGBC's lead advisory committee. And I think she's going to talk more about the city energy project that she's working on.
Yep, great. Thanks. Got up too soon. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. All right, make sure. Where's, oh, there we go. Thank you. So, as Doug mentioned, I'm Lauren Zullo, the Director of National Initiatives with the City Energy Project. I work with NRDC, but it's a joint initiative with a partner nonprofit, the Institute for Market Transformation. They're based in DC. All right, so we're here today to talk to you about building energy. And I've always thought this is a kind of striking chart. The US building sector alone consumes more energy than most countries in the world. It's second only to China and the US consumption as a whole. And as much as 30% of that energy is wasted. In cities, the impact of buildings is especially pronounced. The energy needed to heat, cool, and power our buildings contributes as much as 1/2 to 3/4 of the harmful greenhouse gas emissions that cities are trying to curb. This varies mostly based on how much driving is done in a city. So you'll see here, LA at 51% of their emissions coming from buildings, that percentage gets skewed because they're a very driving heavy city with little mass transit infrastructure. But in other cities, in order to take a significant bite out of your carbon emissions, you really need to be addressing the building stock and addressing it aggressively. So specifically, we must address existing buildings. A building becomes an existing building the day that construction's done and people move in. Marge talked a little bit about how problematic that can be, but we're better off with occupied buildings than empty ones. So existing buildings are especially important because given an average city growth rate, 80% of the buildings standing today will still be standing in 2050. So while new construction and codes are very effective and really important ways to meet our climate goals, we really need to be looking at the existing buildings and finding ways to harvest the energy savings potential from those buildings that are standing and in use today. Let me get back for a second. This is somewhat new territory. Municipalities have often left existing buildings relatively untouched from regulation. They'll typically have requirements around health and fire and life safety, but beyond that, it's often, once it's built, it's kind of yours. This is starting to change as cities realize that they need to be reducing energy consumption in order to hit these aggressive climate goals. So to tap into that savings potential, cities are trying to put the conditions in place to encourage private sector investment and to build the market for energy efficient buildings. So I just want to take a second to introduce you to the City Energy Project. We're grant funded by 3 generous organizations, Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Kresge Foundation, and Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. And they fund NRDC and IMT to partner with 10 cities across the US to help them design and implement policies and program packages that advance energy efficiency in their built environment, helping to make them healthier and more prosperous. The 10 cities where we're working, you can see them up here, but it's Boston, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Orlando, your neighbors in Chicago, Kansas City, Missouri, Houston, Denver, Salt Lake City, and Los Angeles. These are all pretty big cities, and we looked in this initial year of support, or several years of support, to find a lot of geographic diversity. We didn't want this to be a coastal effort. And we looked for diversity of kind of political climate and utility structures to make sure that we could test this theory of change and make sure that it could happen in more than, you know, just San Francisco and New York where it's happening right now. So what the City Energy Project does is provide a short-term infusion of resources and expertise to jumpstart a city on a path towards energy efficiency. We do this by staffing city advisors on the ground in each of the cities. They often sit in the mayor's office of sustainability, or maybe in the Department of Environment. Kind of depends on how the city is structured. And then they work locally, and folks like myself work nationally to help build the infrastructure that will support efficiency policy and programs in those cities. So this includes activities like building engaged networks of stakeholders who support the policies, but also participate in programs. We establish workforce development programs so that the folks working in buildings are trained up on how to run these optimally. We develop and provide access to tools that help cities manage the infusion of building data that they're starting to get, and then figure out how to turn that around and message it back to the users and occupiers of buildings about what this data means and why it's important. We also provide technical support as cities are looking to stand up new programs, such as clean energy financing vehicles or energy reduction challenge programs. We have a whole suite of tools and resources that we help them use to establish those. So I'm going to focus today on the benchmarking and transparency policy, which is really fundamental to the way that City Energy Project thinks about and approaches energy efficiency at the city level. Benchmarking is the process of gathering your energy consumption data along with your building use characteristics like size, occupancy, hours of operation, what's going on in the building, and putting that into, we typically advocate for Energy Star Portfolio Manager's tool. And that normalizes your building's energy consumption against various use characteristics, weather data as well. And it gives you a score on how your building is performing relative to its peers. And then the second key piece of this is transparency of that information. That means that the information is annually disclosed to the city, and the city then can either, it depends on how the law is set up, but the city will either then disclose that data annually in a public report, for example, or it's required to be disclosed at the time of a real estate transaction, like a lease or a sale. And so transparency, we believe, is the key to transforming the market for energy efficient buildings. And so I'm just going to walk you through this cycle. But what happens in an environment where a benchmarking and disclosure law has been adopted is that all buildings covered under the law will measure their energy consumption, and most will get a score of 1 through 100. That data is then made public. What happens next is that the market compares relative performance of the buildings, and hopefully the real estate decision makers will value efficient buildings more highly. We've already seen this happening in the green building industry, especially through labels like Energy Star certification or LEED certification. They've been fetching higher rents and sale prices for years, and there's data to back that up. But required transparency really opens this market up. So as a more familiar example, instead of just being able to see nutritional information for the healthy food products that may voluntarily choose to disclose their nutritional data on the label. A law like this requires all buildings to disclose their energy use. So now you'll also see how many calories may be in that unhealthy McDonald's value menu. And you can make your choices accordingly. There's no regulation around what you need to do or what improvements you need to make, but it's really just about access to information. We expect then that consumers of buildings, which are the tenants, the investors, the people who buy and sell buildings, will then value efficiency and pay accordingly. This will lead then to investment in efficiency so that buildings can stay competitive in the market, and will continually raise the bar in jurisdictions that have these policies in place. So we're seeing a lot of momentum in the market. To date, there are 14 cities with benchmarking and transparency laws in place that touch either commercial or multifamily or both. And a handful of other cities, counties, and states that have some sort of benchmarking policy in place, whether it's single-family homes or they're benchmarking their state and municipal buildings. That actually, if we were showing every dot on here where municipalities were benchmarking their own buildings, this would be much more lit up as well. So there's a lot of movement in the market to support this type of approach. The City Energy Project strongly advocates, though, to go beyond this and to take an integrated approach to energy efficiency. So in terms of what cities are putting into place, this is just an example. I can't always share too much about what cities are planning. But this is just an example of efficient city and a theoretical kind of policy and program package that they may put into place. So this integrated approach includes 4 main pillars to how you can approach your sort of thinking to integrated efficiency policy. And those are kind of seen on the y-axis here, and I'll start at the bottom. Information and transparency is really what it sounds like. It's just providing that access to information that building owners may not have had previously, that tenants have never had. And so that starts with benchmarking and transparency, but it can be taken up a notch through required periodic energy auditing. So cities like New York, San Francisco, Boston have put ordinances like this in place where buildings are required to undergo an energy audit every 5 or 10 years, depending on the location. And that provides the decision makers with the information that they need to act upon suggested improvements. It identifies opportunity and arms them with information and financial sort of metrics to act upon that. The second is about raising the baseline. And this is really about encouraging proven, cost-effective solutions. So we're seeing cities take various approaches to this, but some cities you're seeing adopt required retro-commissioning ordinances. So again, this is periodic. Every 5 or 10 years, a city will need to undergo a commissioning process. The payback on commissioning depends who you ask, but anywhere from about 0.8 years to usually less than 1.5. So very quick payback, and it's really a proven cost-effective solution. And so some cities are allowing this to be voluntary and putting incentive and rebate programs in place to encourage retro-commissioning, but others are starting to take a mandatory approach. Lighting upgrades are another proven cost-effective improvement, and we've only seen one city so far take a mandatory approach, but New York City is requiring by 2025 that all buildings upgrade their lighting to meet the current energy code at the time of the upgrade. And that is going to be a very impactful policy. So, and then code compliance also comes into play here. And as Marge mentioned, codes are really about setting the floor and establishing that baseline. code compliance is very important. As she mentioned, it can be very understaffed, and the buildings departments are often hugely overwhelmed and under-resourced. So taking a look internally, cities can say, here's how we're doing on code compliance today. Here's the target where we want to get to. Maybe that's going to be 80% compliance by 2020. And phasing that in and really designing a program to dedicate resources to making sure that these newly constructed buildings are meeting code. Moving up, it's a market investment. And this is really about reducing the barriers to investment, real or perceived, that exist today. So green leasing is one example. Cities have adopted programs or rolled out programs that educate tenants, landlords, brokers, and leasing attorneys on best practices in leasing to ensure that building owners and tenants have their financial incentives aligned to really reap the benefits of energy efficiency improvements. Also falling under here, it's not shown, would be financing programs. So we're working with cities to help set up property assessed clean energy financing programs, as well as various other financing vehicles that really provide owners with the access to the capital that they need to make efficiency improvements. And the final piece is leading by example. This is perhaps the easiest approach that cities can take, but a very important one. It provides the opportunity for energy leaders to be recognized as such. And so you'll see this in energy reduction challenge programs, where the leading buildings can improve their performance or show that they're truly leaders in the market and get recognition from the mayor or from the city in some other format. And it also means that cities are committing to the policies that they're putting in place and really putting their money where their mouth is. So they'll commit to energy savings in their own buildings and their own operations. So these mandatory policies and voluntary programs are all meant to work sort of in tandem to push both public and private sector buildings towards efficiency. And this kind of shows some of the estimated savings that this theoretical city would achieve in the year 2030. But you can kind of see it is difficult to parse out which energy savings are attributable to which program or which policy. And so while this integrative approach is very effective, it can also be difficult to measure on the back end. And so now just to focus back in on benchmarking and transparency as a keystone sort of policy approach, we're going to quickly take a closer look at Chicago's energy benchmarking ordinance. So they adopted the ordinance in 2013 with broad support from the real estate, environmental, and other industry groups. It will eventually require all public and private sector buildings over 50,000 square feet to annually benchmark using Energy Star Portfolio Manager and disclose that information to the city, which will then make it publicly available. It's being phased in over a few years. And so, but eventually the ordinance will it'll touch just less than 1% of all of the buildings in Chicago, but it will impact 20% of the energy use of the city as a whole. And this is really important when you consider Chicago's greenhouse gas inventory that shows that building energy is responsible for 71% of their greenhouse gas emissions. So we're going to take a quick look at some of the early results that we've seen. And again, the ordinance is being phased in. So last year, 2014, was the first year where reporting was required. And it was only required for commercial buildings over 250,000 square feet. So these are big buildings. It's doing relatively well. It had great participation the first year, a 90+% compliance rate. And it showed a median Energy Star score of 76 out of 100. The national median is 50. And so this may seem a little suspect, but keep in mind that these are the largest of the buildings. So they're also professionally managed and often trophy skyscraper buildings in downtown Chicago. So it isn't crazy that they have relatively good energy performance. But we also learn some interesting lessons. One common misconception that we've seen, as several cities have now kind of found similar results, is that older buildings will consume a lot more energy than newer buildings because they're leaky or they have old equipment or the codes weren't as stringent at the time. But we can see here that's not necessarily the case. And one thing that cannot be understated is that even in this first year of reporting, this is unprecedented data. The city of Chicago, prior to this year of reporting, couldn't have told you how many buildings were built pre-1900 or in the 1900s, 1910s. Just that information about your building stock is unprecedented in terms of what the city actually knows about its built environment. How many buildings, how old are they, how big are they, what goes on in them. This is all new information that the city will understand, that its policymakers will understand, and that energy practitioners and utilities can start to understand, and hopefully create policies and programs that are much more effective than what we've seen in the past when we've been in the dark about what our energy performance looks like. To dive even deeper into this, we see here with granularity what sources of energy office buildings are using, broken out by the decade in which they were built. So this is a pretty specific graph, but we can see here that buildings constructed after 1980 are much less likely to use natural gas on site, but there's been a little resurgence of natural gas and district chilled water in use since the 2000s. And so armed with this information, can we better design utility incentive programs and rebate programs to more effectively achieve the energy savings required by state regulators? Can cities better identify demand-side reductions and efficiency opportunities to help states comply with the Clean Power Plan? There's a lot of opportunity in understanding our building stock better, our fuel mix better, and the deeper that policies go, with an energy audit policy, for instance, we could even look at this and understand which specific pieces of equipment are in place. And that's the type of information that cities are getting, and they're very excited about the opportunity to hone in on targeting those programs so that they're really getting the most energy savings for the cheapest dollar amount. And this is just the first, actually, let me jump in here. Just to sort of recap, Chicago identified some major opportunities for improvement. Just based on that first sort of cohort of 350 buildings, they identified about 13 to 23% total energy reduction, cost-effective energy reduction opportunity, which would yield about $44 to $77 million in energy cost savings annually, 460,000 to 844,000 tons of avoided GHG emissions, and the potential for about 1,000 new jobs to be created if all of the identified energy savings opportunities were undertaken. And so then just looking ahead, this year in 2015, approximately 5 times more buildings were required to comply. So this includes all commercial buildings over 50,000 square feet and all multifamily buildings over 250,000 square feet. So this phase-in means that now we'll have about 1,500 buildings complying with this ordinance. What's also interesting about 2015 is it's the first time that the buildings that reported last year, those 350 of the largest commercial buildings, will have their individual building energy use profiles disclosed. So as a service provider, you can then look up by address the poorest performing buildings and reach out to them with opportunities for improvement. Or as one of the highest performing buildings, you can then be recognized as such. And as a tenant, you can go and look specifically building by building to see where a building where you're considering a lease may fall. So that's an exciting opportunity. And then as the law phases in over time, that individual building disclosure will continue to phase in as well. So if I can just leave you with some final thoughts. What we found through this project are a few key things. One is that American cities will lead. We've talked a little today about some of the gridlock at the federal level and some of the workarounds that the administration has taken. Many states do not have the political will or the authority to regulate buildings. So cities are really going to lead because they have not only that political will, but also the concentration of buildings, the professionals, the knowledge base, and the resources to make change happen. We also found that this focus on large existing buildings will help cities be especially impactful. These are the major energy consumers, and they're the facilities with the resources and staff to make changes happen. We also need to advance proven solutions. There's a lot of great research and pilot work going on with very cool new technologies, including here at University of Wisconsin. But we need to find ways to identify the best practices and bring them to scale quickly. A lot of the policy work that we're doing, we hope will set the conditions that enable those cool new technologies to take root and to become cost effective. The next is that this work cannot be done without partnership. Every group that's working in this space has limited resources, and to leverage those, we must be working together. There's a huge opportunity for academics and university partners to play a role in analyzing the data that's coming into cities and making policy recommendations. Working with the other groups that you're working with, to identify those best practices and identify the new technologies and help bring those to scale is a really important opportunity. And the final point is that data is everything. We can't make decisions in the dark. And foundational policies like benchmarking and transparency arm us with the information that we need to design smart policies and effective programs without some of the waste that we're seeing when we're designing these more in the dark. So this data will help us design programs up front and then also track that progress over time to make sure that we're on track to hit our very important climate goals. So, that's it. Thank you.